And we have been in John chapter 8. We're going to start there in John 8, but we're not going to stay in John 8. We're going to go from John 8 to John 10. But really, the introduction to what we're going to study comes from or starts in John chapter 8. And that is from starting in verse 48. Now, of course, Jesus is interacting with the Pharisees. And all that happens between John chapter 8 and John chapter 10, we see is still dealing with the Pharisees. But notice what Jesus, if you remember, I know this is our fourth sermon from John chapter 8, but if you remember from the past sermons, they are trying to trick Jesus. They're trying to get him to where they can kill him. And so there's been an interaction with Jesus saying he is the light of the world, Jesus dealing with the woman and caught in adultery, Jesus talking about how his father is God, their father is of the devil. They're trying now to respond to that. Jesus has accused them of claiming to be sons of the Father, but Jesus says their actions match the devil's, and that is their father. And so, starting in verse 8, it says, Then the Jews answered and said to him, Do we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? So their first reaction to Jesus saying that their father is of the devil because of their actions is to say he is a Samaritan. Well, a Samaritan is a derogatory term at that time. They are looking down on them. They hated Samaritans. And so they say, well, you're a Samaritan. Not only that, they say, you have a demon. Well, by claiming that he has a demon is saying that his father is Satan. So notice verse 49. Jesus answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. And I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks and judges. Most assuredly I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never see death. Then the Jews said to him, Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham is dead and the prophets, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never taste death. There is a lot in that statement. But we're going to talk about that when we get to John chapter 11. We're not going to focus on that right now. But they're saying, well, you say that if you obey my words or believe my words, you'll never die. They're saying, well, Abraham's dead. The prophets are dead. Are you saying that they have not followed God? What did Jesus say? Verse 53. And are you greater than your father Abraham, who is dead, and the prophets are dead, who do not make yourself out to be? Jesus answered, If I honor myself, my honor is nothing. It is my Father who honors me, of whom you say that he is your God. Yet you have not known him, but I know him. And if I say I do not know him, I shall be a liar like you, but I do not know him, but I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Think about that. Jesus living a couple thousand years in the flesh, a couple thousand years past Abraham, maybe 1500. Jesus says, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. In their minds, how is that possible? Notice what they say. Then the Jews said to him, You are not 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, Most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. What is their reaction? Then they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Why is it that they were so angry that Jesus said he is the I am? Well, that goes back to Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14. I don't think I have this in your notes. So Exodus 3 and verse 14 is the first time we see that statement. As Moses is speaking to God from the bush, which is Jesus, as he's speaking to him from the bush, and Jesus is saying, I am sending you, at that time he's second the Godhead, but I am sending you to bring my people out of Egypt. He said, well, how are they going to know that you sent me? And what did God say there? He said, tell them I am sent you. See, that statement has a lot of power. And they understood that. They understood what the I am meant. Well, that means that he is the eternal. He is deity. He is God. And so Jesus standing there saying, I am, is a reference to that Old Testament phrase used by God in Exodus 3 and verse 14. That's what made them mad. Because they wanted to see Jesus as just a false prophet. They wanted to see Jesus as just a man who they wanted to die, who they wanted to be killed. Yet Jesus said, I am. Now, as you go through the book, there are 7 I ams. We've already looked at one of them. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. We're going to see a few more as we go through this book. I don't know if we're going to talk about every single one of them. But the one that I want to focus on this morning comes from John chapter 10. And it is, I am the good shepherd. And so Jesus talks about how he is the shepherd, or the good shepherd. And so we turn over to John chapter 10. We're going to start in verse 1 and read through 1 through 6. Jesus says this, most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice. And he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him. For they know his voice, yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. Jesus used this illustration, but they do not understand the things which he spoke to them. This is still continuing the interaction from chapter 9, which I know we have skipped over. This is the parable, not the parable, but the account of the blind man who is healed. And so Jesus is using this parable, and he's focusing upon a shepherd here. But notice verse 11 through 18. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. But a hireling, he who is not the shepherd, one does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and does not care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and I am known by my own. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and have power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father. And so this first point we're going to notice, Jesus uses these illustrations, these parables, about 2 shepherds. That's our first point. The 2 shepherds. He focuses upon 2. Kind of similar to chapter 8, where he focuses upon 2 fathers. Here he's going to focus on 2 shepherds. Now, the first shepherd is the wicked shepherds. The wicked shepherds. We're going to talk about Jesus as the door next week, because that's another I am statement from this chapter. And Jesus talks about the door in verse 1 through 6, but he's not using the same, it's 2 different parables. The door really is from verse 7 through 10. And so here in verse 1 through 6, he is really focusing upon the Pharisees, the leaders of that day, the priests, who were to be a shepherd, a type of shepherd, helping lead the flock. And that goes back to the Old Testament principles. But these shepherds, as Jesus says in verse 1, do not enter through the door, but climb the mountain from the back and sneak in. I always think of Sardis. In the book of Revelation, Jesus wrote to Sardis and the history of Sardis. Sardis was on a really high hill, and it was very hard to get into the city unless you came by the one gate that went into the city. And so Jesus is talking about how a normal person would enter in through the normal gate, or one who was allowed to come in would enter through that normal gate. But he says, these shepherds who claim to be a shepherd, the wicked shepherds, they sneak in. They find a little place where they can be out of sight, and they come in because they're like robbers, they're like thieves. These are described as thieves and robbers. That's our blanks there. But of these terms Jesus uses to describe them, it really describes a person who is selfish and only looking out for themselves, who at that time was supposed to be a shepherd, supposed to be a leader of the people, but yet they were focused upon themselves. The Pharisees, the Sadducees. Really it's the priests. Because when we think about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they really came along later in time. They weren't something that God enacted. They were self-appointed leaders of the people, but they claimed to be those shepherds. And so these leaders were like the shepherds that we have today. We have that word shepherd as it refers to an elder. And so they're not the overseeing shepherd, that's God, but they are ones that were to oversee the flock. As we see in Acts chapter 20 and verse 28, Paul told those that were in Ephesus that you were to oversee the flock. And so they were to keep watch. They were to keep guard. They are to watch over the flock. But these priests and leaders at this time instead were looking out for themselves. They were focused upon themselves. They were not focused upon the flock. And so notice what Jesus says about them. Notice verse 5. It says, "Yet they will by no means follow a stranger." They are like a stranger. When you think about a stranger, think about when we were kids, you know that phrase, stranger danger, right? If you don't know them, don't talk to them, right? That's the picture Jesus is giving here. They were to be shepherds, but yet they were a stranger. How are they a stranger? They didn't know the people, and the people didn't know them. Why is that? Because they didn't put the effort in to try to know the people. They didn't put the effort in to try to care about the flock of Israel at that time. They were selfish. The sheep do not know them because they do not care about to get to know them themselves. But not only that, notice verse 12. What does Jesus call them? But a hireling. A hireling. What is a hireling? Well, that's someone that's hired to do a job, right? And so they are a hireling. One that is a hireling does not give his life for the sheep as described in verse 12. He does not care about the sheep. This describes one who is just looking out for themselves. It's just for a job. They don't care. And as Jesus describes, we're going to talk about in a minute, when the wolf comes, when the danger comes, instead of trying to protect the flock, they're like, this is not my flock. I don't care. I'm out of here. And so there, Jesus is describing a leader of people, these priests, these Pharisees, who were to be ones that cared about the flock, but they didn't. Because all they cared about was themselves. They were looking out for themselves. You know, we think about someone that owns we can understand that principle of a flock and owning a flock, and the difference between one that is hired to take care of it and one that owns it. They were the ones that were hired. And so both of these descriptions of a stranger and a hireling fits perfectly with the leaders of that day and what they were like. And so Jesus was rebuking them, but I think it's funny, sad, not funny really. Verse 6, it says Jesus used this illustration, but they did not understand the things he spoke to them. Why is that? They didn't want to hear it. Just like any other parable, it was for those that wanted to understand, those that wanted to hear. The Pharisees didn't understand that. They didn't know it was talking about them because they didn't care. All they cared about was themselves. You know, we think about shepherds. You know, we think about elders today as a shepherd. They're to be ones that cared about the flock. We don't have elders here, but hopefully we will in the near future. And they're to be ones that care for the flock, who give their life for the flock. And so that's the second shepherd that we're going to see here, that that should be the shepherd, Jesus says the good shepherd. The other shepherd is one who enters by the door or the correct way. Notice verse 2. John 10 verse 2, it says, "But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep." Who is that shepherd? Notice verse 10. "The thief does not come to steal, or come except to steal, and to kill, and to destroy. I have come that they may have life, that they may have it more abundantly." Verse 11, "I am the good shepherd." Jesus says he is that good shepherd. This is a great connection here, because this statement really connects Jesus to the Old Testament. Some passages here I'm not going to read, they're here for your notes, but Psalm 23 and verse 1, Psalm 79 verse 13, 80 and verse 1, 95 and verse 7, all point to the fact that God was the good shepherd of Israel. And so when Jesus is standing there, just like when he said, "I am," in chapter 8, when Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd," they understood that. They understood that he is God. He is claiming deity. He is connecting the Old Testament prophecies about God being a shepherd to him. Jesus' claim and proof of his deity. Of course, those who wanted to understand, were honest and wanted to hear, would understand. But the opposite for the leaders of that day, they didn't care. But notice the difference in the description of this shepherd, the good shepherd, Jesus, compared to the wicked shepherds. Notice verse 3. It says, "To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls on his own sheep by name and leads them out." He is let in. He is let in because they know the shepherd. Now, like I said, there's two different parables here, 1 through 6, 7 through 10. We're going to talk about 7 through 10 next week. And so the door is really not the same in both parables. But the picture here is of the doorkeeper letting the shepherd in because the shepherd is known by them. They know who he is. They understand that he's a good shepherd. And that's what Jesus says here. Instead of being a stranger and a hireling, he is known by his flock. Also, verse 3, it says, "And he calls his sheep by name and leads them out." He is the owner of the sheep, and they know him. Verse 3 again, he leads them and he cares for them. Verse 11, he says, "I am the good shepherd." The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. He gives his life for the sheep. Think about that in the contrast of the hireling one. They don't care about the flock. But Jesus cares enough to even give his life for the flock. We're going to talk about more of that later. And then verse 14, it says, "And I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known by my own." He knows his sheep. And so the comparison here was spoken of leaders of Israel before. This is kind of a lengthy reading, so I'm going to leave it for you to read. But I encourage you to go to Ecclesiastes 34. In Ecclesiastes 34, really the whole chapter, verse 1 through 10 really focuses upon the wicked shepherds. Here Jesus is making the same reference as Ezekiel did to the leaders of that day. How they were to be shepherds, but they were not. They were wicked. They had no care for God, for his sheep. They only looked out for themselves. Very similar to what Jesus is talking about here. But then Ezekiel 34, 11 through 15, the owner and the good shepherd of the flock is talked about as God. These statements are spoken of Christ to the religious leaders of Christ's day. And so Jesus is showing that he is God. And so, as we look at Jesus and the two shepherds here, he is that good shepherd. And so what does that mean for us? We look at this chapter, we understand that the immediate context, they were talking about, they were connecting the dots with the Old Testament of Christ being God. He's claiming his deity. They understand that he's talking about the prophecies of the Good Shepherd and how he is that Good Shepherd. But how is it that Jesus is the Good Shepherd for us today? And so that's what I want to focus on next. And so the characteristics of the Good Shepherd, point 2. I want us to notice verse 3 and 4 again. In John chapter 10, verse 3 and 4, it says, "To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice. And he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And he brings out his own sheep. He goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice." Verse 14, "I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known by my own." Jump down to verse 27. Verse 27. Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." And so the good shepherd knows his sheep, and they know him. I know we've stated that before, but I want us to really look at what this means. What does it mean that he knows us? Now, the word used here, know, if you look it up in the Thayer, if you look it up in all of the different lexicons, they say to become acquainted with, to understand, perceive, have knowledge of. Okay, so as we look at this and we think about Christ knowing us, doesn't he know everyone? Yeah, he does. He proved that when he was here in the flesh, right? And as he had interactions with people, he knew their hearts. He knew the Pharisees' hearts here. And so why is that special? Why is that special that God, or Christ, the Good Shepherd, knows us? Well, he knows who are his. That's what it means. He knows who are his. It's not just a general knowledge of people. God knows everyone that's on this earth. God knows everyone that's lived. God knows everyone that's going to live on this earth. That's not the point. The Good Shepherd knows who are his. In verse 3, I think there's an amazing statement we've read over several times. He not only knows them, but he calls them by name. Think about that. He knows this world. He knows everybody that's in this world. But his flock are special. He not only knows you and knows that you're his, but he knows your name. He calls your name. Not only knows it, but he calls your name. You think about this illustration of a shepherd and his sheep. You know, he's not one who just calls his sheep to come to him. He calls them individually by name. That shows a personal aspect to that relationship that he has with each one of his flock. It really gives meaning to Jesus' other parables about when he loses one sheep, what does he do? He forsakes the other to all go and find the one and brings them back because he cares for them so much. That's because he knows them and calls them by name. And so he knows who are his. You know, we think about Jesus knowing who we are and calling out our names. We can understand that. You know, we can identify our own children out of a group of kids, right? For many of obvious reasons. There are kids, you know, the mothers, they've birthed them, so they know who they are. They're not going to say, well, I don't know if that's my child or not. But they do know them because of that. But our children look like this, right? Many times people can say, I know that's your kid, or that's a Richardson, or that's, you know, whatever. They can see because there's similarities. But they also can know them because they may act like us. They may imitate us, right? And so Jesus knows we are his in that similar way. Christians are born again of Christ, right? Into his body, into his fold, into his flock. Christians are to act like his, right? They have the same characteristics of him. They are to imitate him. They are to be like him. And so Jesus can look out into the world and say, I know that one's mine. I can call him by name or her by name because they imitate me. They look like me. They act like me. The world can do the same thing. It should be able to. That person's different. That person's a Christian because they don't do the things that other people do. They may not do the things that I do. And I'm not talking about me, but them in that situation. And so Jesus, knowing who are his, he can do that because of their characteristics. They practice righteousness, 1 John chapter 2 and verse 29. And so Christ can look out into the world and know who is his and know that. And so here the Good Shepherd knows him, or knows us. But notice it also said we can know him. How do we know him? Well, we learn to know him through studying of his word, right? We can study his words and know that what Jesus is like, his characteristics, the things that we need to imitate. We can know who he is. We learn about who he is through studying of his word. We can learn to know him when we understand the love that he has for us, right? The great love that Christ has for us. We learn to know him by that. We learn to know him because we understand he gave his life for us. He gave his life for us. And so, not only does the shepherd know us, the sheep of his flock know him. And that's why they let him in the door. And so those that know him follow him because they know and love him. But not only that, verse 3 tells us the good shepherd leads and cares for his sheep. And I want to go to Psalm 23 because you can't talk about the good shepherd without going to Psalm 23. Because there is a strong connection between what Jesus is saying here and what is read and what has been written by David in Psalm 23. This is specifically talking about Christ. And so Psalm 23, we notice this. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me, he makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters." So the first thing we notice, when it says, "I shall not want," when it says that he leads us to pastures, he is supplying our needs. Jesus takes care of us. Matthew 6 and verse 33. Many other passages, the things that we need, he gives us. And so it's like that shepherd taking care of his flock, who is leading them to the green pastures, leading them to the things that they need, taking care of the things they need. Notice verse 2. Also, beside the still waters. Still waters means peace. He brings peace to his flock's lives. Verse 3. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. When he talks about restoring my soul, how he leads me to the paths of righteousness, that means salvation. His shepherd is that salvation. The shepherd, Christ, is our salvation. Verse 4, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me." The rod and the staff, he protects us and he guides us through life. One commentator said this, here Jesus is depicted as having the rod of correction and the staff of support. That's what it means. He has what he needs to discipline, to correct, but he also has what is needed to support and to protect us. And so there is that rod and staff. Verse 5, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over." The cup running over, this passage is talking about despite what others may do, he takes care of us. No matter what others may do to us in this life, Christ is there for us. And then verse 6, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Dwelling in the house of the Lord forever means we have eternity with him. Eternity with him. Notice John chapter 10. Go back to John chapter 10. There's a lot of similarities between what Jesus is saying in John 10 and really what we found in Psalm 23. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's talking about him. But John chapter 10, notice verse 28 and 29. It says, "And I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall anyone snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of my Father's hand." And so the Good Shepherd leads his sheep in this life and toward eternal life. No one can take that away from us. I love the picture here because it is a picture of his flock in his Father's hand. No one can get us out of there. No one can plug us out. The only way we get out is us, by jumping out. And so the Good Shepherd leads his sheep in this life and towards eternity. Notice the last one. Verse 14 and 15. John 10, verse 14 and 15. We've read this many times. But Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and I am known by my own. And the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and lay down my life for the sheep. The good shepherd gives his life for his sheep. You know, the comparison here is of the wicked shepherds, right? They're robbers, they're thieves, they're only focused upon themselves. When the danger comes, they run. They don't care about the sheep. They don't care what happens to the sheep. They're only getting paid for a job in a sense. They do not care. But Jesus does care. And the good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. That means when danger comes, he protects them at all costs. I think that's why, and as we just read in John 10, 28 through 29, that he gives his life to keep us in his Father's hand. The only reason that we're in the Father's hand, that we are a part of the flock, is because he gave his life for us. And so therefore, we can be in his Father's hand, the picture, the illustration there, because he has gave his life for us. So the danger has come, and the Good Shepherd has given his life to protect our spiritual soul. But as I'm studying this, I want you to think about this for a second. Jesus is speaking about this as he has given his life already. Has he done that yet? This is weeks before he's going to be on the cross. But he is speaking in the present, in the past tense, that he has given his life for his sheep. He hasn't done it yet. But see, Jesus knows what he's going to do, right? He knows that weeks from now, he's going to be on that cross. He knows that weeks from now, he's going to die on that cross for us. He knows what he's going to do. Why is that? Well, it reminds me of 1 Peter 1, verse 18 through 20. How it talks about how Christ was foreordained. His sacrifice, his death was foreordained before the world began. See, there was a plan before the world began for Christ to come to this earth in the flesh, John 1 and verse 14, to live this life as an example for us, and to die on that cross for us. So as Jesus stands here speaking to the people, I don't think they understand the fact that he has already done it, because he knows it's coming, and he's already decided to do it, and nothing's going to stop him. Jesus gave his life for us so that we can have eternal life. What is that danger? Romans 6 and verse 23 says, for the wages of sin is death. See, sin is that danger. Sin is that danger that can remove us from the flock, can keep us out of the flock. But Jesus gave his life to protect us from that danger. Romans chapter 5, one last passage, Romans chapter 5. Notice verse 6 through 11. Romans chapter 5, verse 6 through 11. Paul says this about Christ. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrated his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And not only that, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received the reconciliation. Jesus gave his life for us while we were sinners, so that you and I can be reconciled. You and I can be saved from that danger. No one else can do that. No one else has done that. Only the Good Shepherd can. And that is why he is the I am, the Good Shepherd. Because unlike any other shepherd, he has given his life for his sheep. That shows his love. That shows his care. That shows he's God. And so the great I am is our shepherd. He is eternal. He leads and cares for his sheep. He protects his own by giving his life for them. And as a good shepherd, I want us to think about this. The good shepherd can look out into the world and he can see who are his, right? But not only that, more personal note, the good shepherd can look into this building today and he can know who is his and call them by name. And that's great. That means he knows who are not his also. And so if that means if you do not know him, he doesn't know you. You can fix that today. You can be born again through the baptism, be born into Christ, to be on that way to heaven, to be in that flock, to have his protection, his peace, his salvation that he provides through him. And if you're not a Christian today, you can become one of his and follow him to your eternal home in heaven. And so today, if you're not a Christian, I encourage you to put on Christ today, to be in his fold, to be on your way to eternity with him. If you're not, I encourage you to do it now as we stand and as we sing.